September 18th, 1967. 21:47 hours. Firebase Thien, 3 kilometers from the DMZ. 12 NVA sappers were inside the wire. The trip flares hadn't gone off. Not one. And now enemy commandos, naked except for shorts, bodies greased with mud, were crawling toward the ammo dump. But Lance Corporal Jimmy Malone heard them. Not their footsteps. Not their breathing. He heard bells. Tiny brass bells he'd strung on fishing line 2 weeks ago. Bells the gunny had called, quote, Mickey Mouse bullshit. Those bells were ringing. And they were telling him exactly where the sappers were. For the next 17 minutes, a 19-year-old coal miner's kid from Scranton would defend his sector with a system he'd built from beer cans, fishing line, and cigarette trade bells. 14 NVA sappers would die in the wire. 1 Marine would die in the mortar pit. And a homemade alarm system would spread to every firebase on the DMZ. Jimmy Malone didn't choose Vietnam. The draft notice came in January 1967, 3 months before high school graduation. His father had worked in the anthracite mines. His grandfather had worked in the mines. Every Malone man since 1893 had descended into those black seams. Jimmy was supposed to be next. But his mother had other plans. You're going to college. You're getting out. The draft board didn't care. They needed bodies for I-Corps. Jimmy's birthday came up in the lottery. His father, a Navy veteran of the Pacific, tried to be stoic. Do your duty. Come home. But Jimmy saw guilt in his eyes. This war wasn't like the one his father had fought. Even in Scranton, the protests had started. He'd enlisted to choose his MOS 0311, Rifleman, USMC. If you had to go with the best. So why does any of this matter? Because understanding who Jimmy was before Vietnam explains what he did during it. He wasn't a military prodigy. He was a working-class kid who fixed things when they broke. Because in the mines, if something broke and you didn't fix it, men died. The 707 touched down at Da Nang on May 3rd. The heat hit like a physical blow. 105 degrees, humidity you could chew. The smell overwhelmed everything. Jet fuel, human waste, rotting vegetation, and something sweet and terrible he'd later learn was death. An old salt with 60 days left laughed at the boots stumbling off the plane. Welcome to the shit. Forget everything they taught you stateside. You'll learn the real core here, or you'll get fragged by some FNG who followed the manual. But here's what the manual didn't teach. How to survive when your defensive systems failed. How to improvise when standard equipment didn't work. Jimmy was assigned to 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, they called themselves, a nickname earned through the highest casualty rate in I-Corps. Thien sat 3 kilometers south of the DMZ, shelled daily by NVA 152mm guns the Marines couldn't reach. September 1967 was the worst month, over 3,000 rounds some days. Artillery wasn't the NVA's only weapon. They employed sappers, elite commandos, trained to infiltrate American positions. These men moved naked except for shorts, their bodies covered in mud or fish oil. They exploited gaps in wire and the chaos of artillery bombardments. So how were Marines supposed to stop them? Conventional doctrine relied on 3 layers: trip flares for early warning, claymore mines for killing zones, and alert sentries with interlocking fields of fire. But there was one problem. In monsoon rains, trip flares failed constantly. The clay mud muffled sounds. Visibility dropped to meters. Sentries, exhausted from weeks of shelling, struggled to stay alert. If sappers reached the ammo dump, 175mm artillery rounds, 81mm mortar rounds, thousands of small arms ammunition, the entire firebase could go up. 200 Marines killed in one explosion. Corporal Eddie Ramos, a tunnel rat from the Bronx, first showed Jimmy the gap in their defenses. See those trip flares? Ramos pointed at the perimeter wire one evening. They're supposed to light up sappers, but in monsoon, useless. Rain shorts out the ignition. I watched 3 NVA sappers crawl right past them last September. Didn't see them until they were 20 meters inside the wire. What happened? Machine gunner got lucky. Heard something. But we lost half the 81mm mortar pit. Here's what Jimmy realized. The entire defensive system depended on equipment that failed exactly when you needed it most, and men were dying because of it. "There's got to be a better way," Jimmy said. "Then figure it out, Boot," Ramos replied. "Because thinking outside the manual is how you stay alive in the NAM." Jimmy had been working on the alarm system for 2 weeks. The concept was simple. So simple it seemed stupid. Fishing lines strung 6 inches off the ground through the wire obstacle, attached to small brass bells he'd gotten from a Kit Carson scout. The bells were threaded onto the line at 15-foot intervals. When someone disturbed the wire, the vibration traveled down the line and made the bells ring. Staff Sergeant McKinley had laughed. "What are you, a Boy Scout?" "We have trip flares for early warning, Marine." "Trip flares don't work in the rain, Gunny." "Then fix the trip flares. Don't build some Rube Goldberg horseshit." But Jimmy kept working. He'd counted the failures. In the past month, trip flares had a 15% success rate during rain. 3 Marines had died because they didn't know sappers were in the wire until too late. He tested the tension. Too tight, and the line would break. Too loose, and the bells wouldn't ring. He positioned the bells inside the perimeter, where he could hear them but the enemy couldn't see them. The cost? 4 cartons of cigarettes, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and his Zippo lighter. By September 18th, Jimmy had 42 bells strung across his platoon's sector. 3 lines of 6-pound test fishing leader, invisible in the darkness. Nobody believed it would work. First contact came just after 2100 hours. NVA artillery opened up, 130mm rounds that sounded like freight trains before they impacted. Jimmy pressed himself into the mud as explosions marched past. 40 meters, 30, 20. Then silence. What does silence after artillery mean? Either the NVA are done, or they're about to hit you with ground forces while you're still deafened. "Stand to!" Sergeant McKinley's voice cracked. "Everyone up. Watch your sectors." Jimmy pulled himself up, M16 slippery in his hands, and peered into absolute darkness. The jungle beyond the wire dripped and rustled. Minutes dragged. 21:10, 21:15, 21:20. Then Ramos whispered urgently, "Movement. Wire." 30 meters out. McKinley. "Pop a flare." The M79 illumination round burst overhead, casting harsh white light. Nothing. Empty jungle. Dead wire. The flare died. Darkness swallowed them again. 21:30 hours. Silence. And then Jimmy heard it. A tiny metallic sound. His homemade alarm was ringing. Just barely. Just enough. Someone was cutting through the wire in his sector. McKinley wasn't on the radio net. No air support. Weather was marginal. Jimmy had no orders, no backup, no help, but his bells were ringing. He could follow protocol, radio it up, wait for orders, hope someone responded, or he could trust what he'd built and act now. 2-3. This is 2-3 Alpha. I've got contact in the wire, my sector. Multiple sappers. Engaging now. He didn't wait for permission. The bells rang again. Sector 3, the weakest point where a mortar crater had disrupted the wire pattern. The sappers knew about gaps like that. Jimmy low-crawled 3 meters left. The mud sucked at his elbows. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might give away his position. Through the darkness, he caught movement. 1 shape, 2, 3 more, 5 sappers, maybe more behind them. The bells rang again. Jimmy saw exactly what triggered it, a sapper's body brushing the wire. The vibration traveled 60 feet back to where the bells hung. "I've got 5 enemy in the wire," Jimmy whispered. "Sector 3, 50 meters. McKinley, confirmed. Do not fire until they clear the wire. We'll hit them in the kill zone." But Jimmy saw the problem. The sappers weren't heading for the kill zone. They were angling left, toward the dead space where the M60 couldn't traverse low enough to cover. They knew exactly where to go. If they reached that dead space, they'd have a clear approach to the mortar pit. From there, 30 meters to the ammo dump. Jimmy made the calculation. Follow orders and lose the advantage, or break protocol and hit them now, while he knew exactly where they were. He raised his M16, aimed at where the bells were ringing, and squeezed the trigger 3 times. The muzzle flash lit up the night. Instantly, the night exploded. Tracers lit up from 6 positions. The M60 roared to life. A K-47 fire answered back, the deeper rattle distinct from M16's. An RPG whooshed past overhead, but Jimmy's bells kept ringing. "Contact left," Ramos screamed. "They're in my wire too." The bells in Ramos's sector were ringing wildly. Classic NVA tactics. Fix the Americans in place, flank with the other element. Patterson beside him wasn't shooting. The kid was frozen, pressed into the fighting hole, hands over his helmet. "Patterson, get your weapon up." Patterson couldn't move, locked up by fear. Jimmy grabbed Patterson's M16, checked the chamber, and braced it on the sandbags alongside his own. 2 weapons, 1 Marine. The bells rang again. Closer, inside the wire. Jimmy fired right-handed, then grabbed Patterson's M16 left-handed and fired toward where the bells indicated movement. A satchel charge exploded 40 meters out. The flash lit up 3 NVA sappers. Jimmy fired 6 rapid shots. 1 sapper went down. The others scattered, but the bells kept ringing in Ramos's sector. "All positions, shift fire left," McKinley's voice cut through. 2, 3 Alpha, keep your sector suppressed." Jimmy understood. McKinley was trusting him to hold his sector alone while the platoon concentrated on the larger threat. The M60 swung left. The rifle fire followed. Jimmy was alone, facing at least 4 sappers, with 1 frozen FNG and 2 rifles. But the bells gave him the edge. Every time they rang, he knew exactly where to aim. A sapper rushed forward. The bells caught the movement. Jimmy fired 4 shots. The sapper went down 10 meters from the wire. Another satchel charge exploded in Ramos's sector, much closer. The blast wave hit like a punch. His ears rang. The bells rang. Everything was ringing. 21:47 hours. 17 minutes since first contact. Ammunition was becoming a concern. Jimmy was on his 4th magazine, 25 rounds left. The bells in his sector had gone quiet. Either the sappers were dead, or they'd learned to avoid the line. But Ramos's sector was still hot. Muzzle flashes from AK-47s inside the wire. Sappers had made it through. "Ramos, talk to me," McKinley called. No response. Jimmy raised his head. Ramos's fighting position was taking fire from 2 directions, outside and inside the perimeter. The bells. Jimmy's bells were telling him where the sappers were. "McKinley, 2-3 Alpha. Ramos is cut off. Sappers are inside his sector. Can you get to him?" 15 meters of open ground. Fully exposed, but the bells were still ringing. And Jimmy could read them. "I'm moving." He grabbed 3 grenades, pulled Patterson's rifle over his shoulder, and rolled into the mud. Tracers overhead, muzzle flashes, the hammering of the M60, his own breathing, ragged and too fast. He low-crawled toward Ramos. 5 meters. 8 meters. AK fire stitched the ground 3 feet to his right. The bells rang behind Ramos's position, sappers moving toward the mortar pit. Jimmy pulled the pin on a grenade, counted 2 seconds, hurled it toward where the bells indicated. He pressed his face into the mud. The grenade exploded. The bells stopped. He scrambled the last 7 meters and rolled into Ramos's hole. Ramos was alive, bleeding. "Where the fuck did you come from? Your bells are ringing." "I'm hit. Left leg. I got you." The bells had started ringing again. 15 meters toward the mortar pit. Jimmy had maybe 60 seconds before the sappers reached the ammo dump, but he knew exactly where they were. "Flares!" Jimmy screamed into the radio. "Pop every flare you got, now!" 3 seconds later, the night turned into day. 6 M79 illumination rounds burst overhead. Harsh white light flooded the perimeter. And there they were, 7 NVA sappers, caught in the open, bodies glistening with mud, satchel charges strapped to their backs. Every Marine who could see them opened fire. The M60 held the trigger down. A 6-second burst, rifle fire from a dozen positions converged. The sappers tried to scatter. 2 went down immediately. 3 more charged forward, desperate, committed, and got cut down. The last 2 turned back and ran into interlocking rifle fire. 10 seconds, then silence. Real silence. No bells. No AK-47s. No movement. The flares drifted down until only darkness remained. Jimmy sat in Ramos's fighting hole, waiting for his hands to stop shaking. They didn't. "You stupid boot," Ramos said. "You crawled 15 meters through fire. Your bells were ringing. The radio. All positions. Status check. Down the line. Okay. 2 wounded. 1 KIA. Doc Martinez. Okay. Jimmy's position. 2-3 Alpha. 2 wounded. Position intact. Enemy KIA. Approximately 12 confirmed. McKinley. Good work. 2-3 Alpha. 46 days left in country." The bells hung silent, waiting for the next attack. But tonight, they'd done their job. Dawn broke at 06:27. Gray light filtered through clouds. The firebase looked like a fresh wound, smoking craters, torn wire, blood trails. Body count: 14 NVA sappers KIA, 1 Marine KIA, Doc Martinez, 22, from El Paso. 4 wounded, including Ramos. McKinley walked the wire with Jimmy. They found the cut strands, the satchel charges, the AK-47s, and Jimmy's bells, still hanging. 12 intact out of 15. McKinley picked up a bell. "This Rube Goldberg horseshit saved our ass." "Yes, Gunny. The trip flares didn't go off. Not one." "No, Gunny. How many did you have strung up?" 42 bells. 3 lines. 6-pound test. Cost you 4 cartons of cigarettes, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and my Zippo." McKinley smiled. "Best investment in the history of I-Corps, Lance Corporal." 3 weeks later, Jimmy received the Bronze Star with V device. The citation praised his, quote, "initiative, tactical innovation, and courageous action under fire." It didn't mention bells or fishing line. Jimmy thought about Doc Martinez, who should have been getting a medal. He thought about Patterson, transferred to the rear. He thought about Ramos recovering in Da Nang, who'd sent word, "Tell that boot he still owes me for the bells." The medal didn't matter. What mattered was that the method worked. Within a month, bell and wire alarm systems appeared in other sectors, then at other firebases. Marines adapted and improved. Some used grenade pins on tripwires. Others used sea ration cans filled with pebbles. The innovation spread Marine to Marine, whispered during watches. Taught to F&Gs. No official training bulletin. No doctrine manual. Just survival knowledge, passed along by men who wanted to make it home. James Malone rotated out December 15th, 1967. He stepped off the 707 at Travis Air Force Base, wearing his dress uniform with the Bronze Star ribbon. A group of protesters met the plane. One called him a baby killer. Another spat in his direction. His father met him in Philadelphia 2 days later. They shook hands. His father, who'd cried when FDR died, looked at his son and didn't know what to say. This war was different. Sharon Kowalski had married someone else. Jimmy found out from his mother, who cried and said Sharon was a fool. Jimmy didn't blame her. Who wanted to marry someone who was jumpy at loud noises, unable to sleep, seeing sappers in every shadow? He tried working in the mines. Lasted 6 weeks before a panic attack underground, the darkness too much like a fighting hole. He tried construction. The sound of a jackhammer sent him diving for cover on his 3rd day. For 3 years, he didn't talk about Vietnam. The nightmares came every night, darkness and bells ringing, and not being able to move fast enough. He worked odd jobs: security guard, night janitor, truck loader, things where people didn't ask questions. In 1972, he met another Vietnam vet at an unemployment office. The vet mentioned Con Thien, and Jimmy just started talking about the bells, about Doc Martinez, about coming home to people who thought he was a monster. The vet gave him a number for a group that met Tuesday nights in a church basement. Jimmy went once, then twice. By the 3rd meeting, he was helping other guys who'd just come back. The bells in the wire system never made it into official Marine Corps training manuals. Too improvised, too dependent on local materials. But among grunts in I-Corps, it became folklore. It appeared in after-action reports as, quote, improvised acoustic warning system, or, quote, non-electrical perimeter alarm. The simple version, beer cans on fishing line, bells on wire, anything that made noise when disturbed, remained the most practical. Decades later, in Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces rediscovered the same principle. Sometimes the lowest tech solution is the most reliable. Motion sensors failed in dust storms. Night vision couldn't penetrate sandstorms. But a wire strung with tin cans worked every time. In 2007, a Marine Staff Sergeant in Ramadi jury-rigged a perimeter alarm using 550 cord and empty MRE bags filled with rocks. When asked where he got the idea, he said, "Old Salt told me about it. Some guy in Vietnam figured it out. Bells or something." That Old Salt was Eddie Ramos. Jimmy Malone lived quietly in Scranton. He got steady work as a maintenance supervisor, married Patricia in 1978, raised 2 daughters. He showed them his medals once, never talked about combat. The nightmares faded but never disappeared. He still startled at loud noises, still did a perimeter check before sleep. Patricia understood. She'd met him at the veterans group where he volunteered. In 1982, Jimmy went to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He found Doc Martinez's name on panel 26E, line 98. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he found 6 other names from his platoon, guys who'd died after he rotated home. He never went back to the wall. Once was enough. Jimmy died in 2004 at 56 from lung cancer. The VA concluded it was Agent Orange related. Thien had been sprayed repeatedly during 1967. Jimmy had breathed it, worn it on his skin, drunk water contaminated with it. At his funeral, Eddie Ramos came. First time they'd seen each other since 1967. Ramos walked with a limp from shrapnel that never healed. He gave the eulogy, talking about a 19-year-old kid who'd saved his life with bells and fishing line. "Jimmy never thought he was a hero," Ramos said. "He'd get pissed if you called him one. But he was the smartest Marine I ever served with. The trip flares didn't work, so he made something that did, and we all went home because of it. That's all he wanted, to go home and to bring his brothers home." James Malone's story isn't about glory. Vietnam didn't have glory, just survival and sacrifice. But his innovation, born from fear, necessity, and a refusal to accept that men had to die because standard equipment failed, shows that even in the most controversial war, individual acts of courage and ingenuity still mattered. Not to win the war. Thien was abandoned in 1968. The Bell systems didn't change Vietnam's outcome. But on September 18th, 1967, they changed the outcome for 37 Marines who lived to see morning. Jimmy Malone didn't save the war. He just saved his brothers. And in the darkness of Thien, with enemy sappers in the wire and no help coming, that was enough. What would you have done with the trip flares not working and enemy sappers in the wire? Could you have built something from beer cans and fishing line that meant the difference between life and death? Could you have kept your head when the FNG beside you froze? What part of this story stayed with you? The 19-year-old Marine improvising in darkness? The Bronze Star recipient who came home to protesters and couldn't hold a job? The Bell system that spread firebase to firebase, never making it into official doctrine? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you served in Vietnam, or know someone who did, let us know. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, stories that honor courage while acknowledging complexity, that respect soldiers while questioning wars, share this with someone who should hear it. Because sometimes the most important innovations come not from generals or engineers, but from 19-year-old Marines who just wanted everyone to make it home. Because soldiers deserve honor even when their wars don't. Because in the mud and fear of Thien, bells on fishing line mattered more than all the doctrine manuals ever written.